My father shook 3 strangers' hands at my graduation. He laughed with them. He posed for photos. He even teared up a little when the dean walked past. Then someone asked him, right in front of me, "Is this your son?" He looked at me. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he turned slightly, put his hand on my sister's shoulder instead, and said, "This is my daughter, Melissa. She's the one starting pre-med in the fall." The man smiled at Melissa. I stood there in my graduation gown, holding a rolled-up diploma that had my name on it. Nobody corrected him, not my mother, not my aunt, not even my sister, who at least had the decency to look down at her shoes. Just silence. And my father, already moving on to the next conversation. I was 22 years old that day. I had just graduated with honors from an engineering program that almost broke me, and my father forgot to say yes. I never forgot that. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 now. And before I tell you what really happened, I need you to understand something about where I came from. Because this story isn't about one moment at a graduation. It's about 12 years of moments that looked almost like love. Almost. My father, Richard Mercer, built a mid-sized construction company in Ohio from nothing. That part is true, and I'll give him credit for it. He worked hard. He had calloused hands and a temper that could clear a room. And he had 2 children. Melissa, my older sister by 3 years. Quick with words, charming with people, beautiful in the way that made adults lean toward her at dinner parties. She got her mother's eyes and her father's confidence. And then there was me, the quiet one, the one who stayed in his room, the one who took things apart and put them back together just to understand how they worked. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't rebellious. I just wasn't visible. Somewhere around the time I was 10 years old, I figured out the rule. Not through any dramatic moment, not through shouting or cruelty, just through pattern. When Melissa had a bad day, my father drove 40 minutes to bring her ice cream. When I had a bad day, he told me to stop sulking and set the table. When Melissa's grades slipped junior year, he hired a tutor who came 3 times a week. When my grades slipped, because I was working a part-time job at 14 to save for a calculator I needed for school, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You're going to end up average, Daniel. I'm just being honest with you." I was 14. I looked at the table and didn't say anything. Because what do you say to that? My mother wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that, because her story is more complicated. She loved me. I genuinely believe that. But she loved peace more. And keeping my father happy was how she kept peace. So over years and years of small decisions, whose sports game to drive to, whose recital to photograph, whose school project to help with, she followed his lead. And his lead was always toward Melissa. I don't think he hated me. That would almost be easier to understand. He just didn't see me as the return on investment he had hoped for. Melissa was pre-med, she was social, she walked into rooms and people lit up. I was engineering, I was quiet. I walked into rooms and found the nearest wall. He was a man who understood value in terms of what other people thought. And Melissa gave him something to talk about at dinner parties. I gave him silence and a son who asked too many questions about how things worked. The summer I turned 17, I told him I wanted to apply to State's engineering program. He put down his fork, looked at me the way men look at something that's mildly inconvenient. "Engineering," he said. Like the word tasted strange. "Mechanical, yeah. Who's paying for that?" I told him I was applying for every scholarship available, that I'd already been researching for months. He picked his fork back up. "Don't come asking me when it doesn't work out." That was the whole conversation. No good luck. No let's talk about this. Just a preemptive exit from any responsibility for my future. I got a partial scholarship and 3 smaller grants. I covered the rest with loans and 2 jobs. I never asked him for $1. Not once. 4 years. That's how long the engineering program was. 4 years of 6 a.m. alarms, double shifts at a campus restaurant on weekends, study groups that ran past midnight, and professors who spoke in a language I had to translate in real time, while also pretending I wasn't exhausted. I called home maybe once a month. The conversations were always the same. My mother asked if I was eating. I said yes. She told me Melissa had gotten into her second-year rotations. I said that was great. My father, if he was nearby, would occasionally pick up the second phone and ask something like, "What year are you again?" "Third year, Dad." "Right." Click. I graduated with a 3.7 GPA. I had job offers from 2 firms before the semester even ended, one in Cincinnati, one in Pittsburgh. I chose Cincinnati because the project work was more complex, nothing to do with being close to home. I sent my parents the graduation invitation 6 weeks early. My mother called to say they'd be there. My father didn't call, but he came, which I told myself was enough. Graduation day in May. The engineering quad filled with families in their good clothes, cameras out, kids in gowns with those ridiculous flat hats that keep sliding forward. It was overcast, but warm. The kind of day that feels important without being dramatic. I walked across the stage. I heard my mother somewhere in the crowd. A small sound, like she caught herself before cheering too loud. I didn't hear my father. Afterward, families converged on the lawn, everyone finding each other in the crowd, hugging, photographing, laughing too loud out of relief that it was finally over. I found my parents near the edge of the quad. My mother hugged me first, long, genuine. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my entire life. "I'm so proud of you," she said quietly against my shoulder. My father stood behind her. He gave me one of those handshakes that men give when they don't know how to be warm, firm, brief, like closing a business deal. "Good," he said, not "congratulations," not "I'm proud of you." Good, like I had performed a task adequately. Then a man from my father's world appeared. One of those connections he maintained for years, a contractor named Phil something, whose son was also graduating from the business school. They fell into conversation immediately, the way men do when they're more comfortable with acquaintances than family. Phil's wife asked about children. My father gestured. "And here is where I need you to understand something." He didn't forget. He made a choice. He pointed toward Melissa, who was standing slightly behind me, and said, "This is my daughter. She's starting medical school in the fall." Phil's wife clasped her hands. "Oh, how wonderful." "She's sharp," my father said, like he was describing a tool he'd purchased. I stood 18 inches away in my graduation gown. Phil looked at me, politely, waiting. My father kept talking about Melissa. Phil's wife smiled at me, one of those uncertain smiles people give when they sense something is wrong but don't know what. "And this is," she started. "Daniel," I said, my own name, in my own mouth. "Are you also graduating today?" she asked. I looked at her, then at my father. He was already turning back toward Phil. "Yeah," I said, "engineering." "Oh, lovely." And that was it. No correction from my father. "No, of course, this is my son." Nothing. He talked about Melissa for another 4 minutes while I stood beside them. Then he checked his watch and said they had a reservation. I drove back to my apartment alone, sat in the parking lot for a while. The diploma was on the passenger seat. I looked at it, thought about my father's face in that moment. Not angry, not guilty, just absent, like I hadn't been there at all. I put the diploma in the back seat, went inside, and made a decision that I didn't fully understand yet. I would not explain myself to him. I would not confront him, would not send an emotional text, would not bring it up at Christmas. I would simply build something so undeniable that explanation would become irrelevant. And one day, I didn't know how or when, he would have to acknowledge who I was, in front of people, the same way he'd dismissed me, in front of people. Cincinnati. The firm was called Hargrove Engineering Solutions. Mid-sized regional focus, serious about infrastructure work, bridges, drainage systems, structural assessments for municipal contracts. Exactly the kind of quiet, technical, unglamorous work that most people ignored until something broke. I loved it. My manager, a woman named Sandra Okafor, was the first person in my professional life who talked to me like I was already capable rather than potentially capable. First week, she walked me through a project file and said, "I want your read on the stress distribution model they used. Tell me what you see." Not, "Let me explain this to you. Tell me what you see." I told her. She nodded, made a note. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I thought too." That interaction cost her maybe 4 minutes. It changed something in me. For 3 years, I worked harder than I thought I could. Not because I was trying to prove something to my father, at least not consciously, but because for the first time, the work itself felt like it was mine. Fully mine. Earned without anyone's help, without anyone's name attached. I got promoted at 25, got a small raise at 26. At 27, Hargrove put me on a federal infrastructure contract that required security clearance and a level of detail that meant I barely slept for 4 months. I didn't mind. During those years, I called home on birthdays and holidays. My mother and I talked genuinely. She asked about work. She told me about the neighborhood, the garden, a neighbor's dog she'd started feeding. My father got on the phone occasionally. The conversations were always brief. "How's the job?" "Good." "Making decent money?" "Getting there." "Melissa's practice is doing well. She's got her own patients now." "Good for her." Then silence. Then he'd hand the phone back to my mother. I noticed he never asked what I was working on, not once. Not the bridge project that made the local news, not the federal contract, not the time our firm's work was cited in a state infrastructure report. Just, "How's the job?" Like it was all one undifferentiated thing, like it didn't matter enough to understand. And that would have been fine. I had stopped needing it to matter to him. Except, 28 years old. I was back in Ohio for Christmas. Sitting at the dinner table, my mother's cooking, the same plates they'd had since I was small, the dining room that always smelled like it was just cleaned. My father was in a good mood. Melissa had brought her boyfriend. My mother had made everything from scratch. At some point, my father started talking about business. His company had a new contract, a school renovation downtown. He was proud of it, and he started explaining the structural challenges of the project like he was lecturing a class of people who knew nothing. I listened. Then I offered a thought. Something specific about load calculations in older building frames. My father stopped, looked at me. "Where'd you hear that?" I put my fork down slowly. "It's my job, Dad." He blinked, and I saw it, clear as anything. He had genuinely forgotten what I did. Not in a distracted way, in a fundamental way. He had never fully registered it. I picked my fork back up, finished my dinner, drove home the next morning before anyone was awake, and I sat in my apartment and asked myself, honestly, what I was waiting for. Not for his approval. I had stopped wanting that years ago. But for the moment I had promised myself on that graduation lawn, the undeniable moment I needed to build bigger. 29. Sandra called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She closed the door, sat down across from me, and looked at me the way she had that first week, directly, without ceremony. "We've been approached," she said. "A private infrastructure investment group. They want to acquire Hargrove and scale it. The deal would mean new leadership, new structure, probably a new name eventually." She paused. "But before it's finalized, they want to meet the senior technical team. And Daniel," she tilted her head, "they specifically asked about the lead on the federal contract." That was me. "What are you telling me?" I asked. "I'm telling you that if this deal goes through, there's a seat at the table. A real one. Equity. Not a salary." I sat with that for a second. "And if it doesn't go through?" She almost smiled. "Then we go back to normal and pretend I never said any of this." The deal took 8 months to finalize. During those 8 months, I drafted technical assessments, sat through 40-hour negotiation weeks, flew to meetings in 3 different cities, and at one point rewrote an entire project valuation report over a single weekend because the numbers had shifted. I did not tell my parents, not because I was hiding it, but because telling them while it was still uncertain felt like offering something to be disappointed about. The deal closed on a Thursday in October. Hargrove Engineering Solutions became the regional anchor of a firm called Meridian Infrastructure Group. My title, Director of Technical Operations. My equity stake, enough that I didn't need to think about money the way I used to. I sat in the attorney's office after the signing, looked at the documents with my name on them. Daniel Mercer, Director of Technical Operations, Equity Partner. I thought about a graduation lawn in May, about a man who turned slightly to his left and introduced someone else as his child. I didn't feel angry. I felt ready. 3 weeks after the deal closed, I got a call from my mother. My father's company, his construction company, the one he'd spent 30 years building, had been struggling. She told me carefully, the way she always delivered things she knew would land hard. A municipal contract had fallen through. A subcontractor dispute had cost them badly. The line of credit was stretched. He was looking for a bridge loan to survive the next quarter. I said I'd call her back, and I sat with it. Not the money. The question underneath the money. What kind of man did I want to be? Not for him, for myself. I called my mother back, told her I couldn't help with the loan. I had legal obligations to my new company that made personal financial entanglements complicated. That was true. But I told her something else. Meridian had a division that contracted regional construction firms for project support, site preparation, structural work. The kind of thing a company like my father's used to do regularly. If his company was still capable, I could introduce them, professionally, through channels. My mother went quiet on the phone. "Daniel," she said finally, "you do that?" I told her to have him call the firm's main line, ask for my office. I told her I wouldn't make it easier than that. She understood. He called on a Wednesday morning. I was in a meeting when my assistant knocked and passed me a note. "Richard Mercer says he's returning a call." I finished the meeting, went to my office, closed the door, picked up the phone. "This is Daniel Mercer." A pause on the other end, then his voice, slightly careful in a way I had never heard before. "Danny, it's your father." Nobody had called me Danny since I was 9 years old. "I know," I said. Another pause. "Your mother said you work for the group that's taking on the Riverside contracts." "I'm Director of Technical Operations, yes." Silence. Not the comfortable silence of two men who understand each other. The silence of a man recalibrating. "She said you might be able to." "I can set up a formal vendor review," I said. "Your company would need to submit a capability assessment. Standard process. I don't control the outcome. That goes through procurement." Right, of course." He cleared his throat. I wanted to reach out personally." "I appreciate that." More silence. Then, and I don't think he planned to say it. I think it just came out. He said, "You've done well, Daniel." Not congratulations, not "I'm proud of you," but something. A small, imperfect something from a man who didn't know how to be larger than himself. I looked out my office window. The Ohio River was visible from the 14th floor on clear days. That day, it was. "I graduated with honors," I said quietly. He didn't respond immediately. "From the engineering program, 4 years. I had a 3.7. I had job offers before I graduated." Silence. "I know," he said. "Do you?" The longest pause yet. He stopped, started again. "I haven't always been. I know I wasn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. Men like my father rarely can. I let the silence sit. Then I said, "I'll have my assistant send you the vendor packet. Fill it out completely. The review is fair." "Okay. That's the best I can offer." "I understand." And before he could say anything else, I said, Tell Mom I'll call her Sunday. I hung up, sat for a moment. No triumph, no electricity. Just the quiet, solid feeling of a man who had built something real and wasn't waiting for permission to call it his own. 4 months later, my father's company passed the vendor review. They got a small support contract, enough to stabilize, not enough to be comfortable about. My father and I sat across from each other in a Meridian conference room for the contract signing. He wore his good suit, the one he wore to client meetings in the 90s. There were 3 other people in the room: a procurement officer, a contracts administrator, and my project manager, Joel. When we were introduced, the procurement officer looked at my father. "And you know Director Mercer already?" My father looked at me. Something crossed his face, something I'd never seen there before. Not pride exactly, something more complicated than pride. "He's my son," he said. I wrote my name on the contract, slid it across the table. "Good to work with you," I said, and meant it. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. It never would be completely. But because I had become exactly what I promised myself I would become on that graduation lawn. Undeniable. And he had said it himself, out loud, in a room full of people. He's my son, 12 years late. But I never needed it to be on time. I just needed it to be true. I drove home that evening. Same apartment I'd had for 3 years. Nothing fancy. The kind of place where the heat takes a few minutes to kick on in winter, and the parking lot light flickers sometimes. I made coffee, sat by the window, called my mother. She picked up on the first ring. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice careful, hopeful. "Fine," I said. "Professional." She was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you last night," she said. "After dinner, when he thought I wasn't listening." I didn't ask what he said. She told me anyway. "He said you turned into someone he didn't expect." I looked at the steam coming off my coffee. "What does that mean?" I asked. "I think," she said slowly, "it means he underestimated you, and he knows it." I nodded to myself. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, the city settling into its evening rhythm. "Mom." "Yeah." "At my graduation, when he introduced Melissa to that couple." She went quiet. Did he know I was standing right there? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "He's not a bad man, Daniel," she said finally. "He just doesn't always know how to—" "I know, Mom." I did know. That was the complicated part. He wasn't a monster. Monsters are almost easier. Monsters give you something clean to push against. He was just a man who had decided early on which of his children would return the most on his investment. And he had been wrong. That was all. He had been wrong. I finished my coffee. Told my mother I'd see her at Thanksgiving. Hung up. Sat in the quiet for a while. Then I opened my laptop and started working. Not to prove anything. Not to anyone. Just because the work was mine. And that had always been enough. If you've ever been overlooked by the person who was supposed to see you most clearly, if you know what it feels like to stand in a room full of your own achievement and still be invisible to the one person whose eyes you kept searching for, leave something in the comments. I read them all. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because some of us build our whole lives in the quiet. And the quiet is where the real work happens.